We made this.
Welcome back everyone to a podcast all about the sounds of cinema and discussion about them between the notes, which is where we come in. I'm Tony Black.
And I'm Sean Wilson.
And this week we bring you discussion of music from James Newton Howard, Carter Burwell, Daft Punk and more as we discuss the music of the films of 2010, flashing back 10 years from where we are today. So this was one of those ideas, Sean, as we still await the return fully of new movies and new scores potentially to really dig into and talk about a lot more. This was an idea about maybe looking back precisely a 10-year period and seeing what kind of gems cropped up this time 10 years ago. It's been quite a fun little journey back into memory lane for me. How have you found it?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. I think the idea of time has been on everyone's minds lately, hasn't it? Given what everyone's going through at the moment, everyone is in a state of perpetual reminiscence and thinking, "Oh, you know, where was I a certain period of time ago?" And it's actually really nice looking back at the scores we picked, and I thought, "Blimey, these films are 10 years old. That's amazing." Looking at some of them, like How to Train Your Dragon, The Social Network, and everything, and I was thinking at that point. I mean, just personally, I didn't have the job 10 years ago that I do now. I'm now the editor for Cineworld's website. I didn't have that job back then. I was actually writing radio jingles. Actually, I was writing for radio advertising in Torquay, where I'm from. But I remember just certain impressions from 10 years ago. I mean, I remember when, and this isn't one of the films we're going to cover, Inception. I mean, because we've covered Inception on our separate Christopher Nolan episode that people can check out. But I just remember Inception coming out thinking, blimey, you know, Christopher Nolan is a real hero for creating an original blockbuster that isn't pegged to the Batman mythology and drawing a huge audience as a result. What a saviour he is. But yeah, going through this list of film scores makes me realise what a rich period for film music 2010 was. It was amazing.
I think it was a pretty good year. Absolutely, yeah. I think we've obviously, you know, we always compile like 5 scores each, and I think we've got some real great ones here. I mean, you know, you mentioned Inception, and that was something we talked about, whether or not we talk about Inception again. But as you say, we talked about it not so long back on our Christopher Nolan episode, and it just felt a little bit redundant to maybe just go over all that again. So if you want to hear us talk about Inception, go and listen to that episode. I'd recommend. Otherwise, that would have definitely been on this list for one of us, 100%. You know.
Yeah.
And to be fair, you know, the top 10 films of the year in terms of gross, not all of them are represented on this list. So in that list, you've got things like Toy Story 3, and a lot of these have really good scores as well, but they didn't quite make our list. So you've got Toy Story 3, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1, Shrek Forever After, The Twilight Saga Eclipse, Iron Man 2, Tangled, Despicable Me. None of these are on our list, but they have, to varying degrees, pretty good scores as well. So we haven't necessarily gone for the biggest blockbuster hits, but I'd say we've gone for 10, I'd say pretty recognisable choices that I'm going to guess most people will have seen over the years. And I mean, I'm wondering, Sean, how many of the 10 that we've chosen, how many of them can you remember seeing at the cinema?
I think I saw all of these. I saw all of them, and the spread and the various styles of all these scores that we picked is really diverse. It's really eclectic, and what we've done in this list is we've picked composers with both a classical bearing and also composers that have come from a more of a pop oriented background as well, which is very, very, very interesting. But yeah, I can remember seeing pretty much all of these films in the cinema, and I remember that pretty much all of these scores made an impression on me in one way or another. I spoke one of the actual fascinating things about this is that it draws into greater focus the fact that sometimes terrific scores can be written for dreadful films, and there's a there's a few contradictory examples like that on here of all of the scores are great, but some of the films for which they were written were absolutely appalling. and you know, looking at the list, you know exactly which ones I'm talking about.
Yeah, one in particular that is a renowned, brilliant score for a dog shit film. So that'll be fun. That'll be fun. And I think pretty much all the composers we've picked here are all still working. They're all still pretty well known. They're all still 10 years later doing their thing, which is great. Maybe some to a lesser degree than others, but yeah, it's a really, really hopefully diverse and hopefully enjoyable list. And as always, we will have a Spotify playlist available with the selections. We've got them all. They're all on Spotify this time. So you're going to be able to listen to selections, a good couple of hours of music there from all of these scores. And I would encourage anyone to go and listen to them in full, because all of these scores are in full terrific. And what I've just picked out a few different choice tracks from those. So there's hours worth of great listening for you here.
Yeah, agreed. And there is it's an interesting point actually about that you raised about whether these composers are actually as ubiquitous as they once were. I mean, certainly there's at least one example on this list in the form of Daft Punk, who almost the anomaly on this list in that they made this one score and they haven't done anything since. But apparently they are now attached to a new Dario Argento film. I was reading about that recently, which I know, right? I didn't know about that, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Certain composers on this list made their film score debut, not just Daft Punk, but others, and have now gone on to establish very, very successful collaborations with directors. Certain other composers have kind of solely have started to identify solely with a particular genre. We can get into that. It's a really exciting list. Actually, I'm looking forward to talking about this one.
Yeah, it's good fun. It's gonna be really good. So yeah, make sure you check out our playlist. Do as well if you're not already fully subscribed to the show. Do subscribe on Apple Podcasts or your podcast app of choice. And if you could give us a little bit of a review somewhere, anywhere, ideally on Apple, unfortunately, because Apple control all. If you could do that and give us a little rating, that would be great, just to get us better known in the wonderful film score community. So, without further ado, let's break into our 10 scores and start with one from you, Sean, which is obviously, and all these scores obviously are from the year 2010, so I don't have to say the year every time, but the first one we're going for is John Powell's How to Train Your Dragon.
Yeah, it is just an absolutely wonderful score. Oscar-nominated score for the DreamWorks animation, which apparently was the first DreamWorks animation movie that John Powell had tackled on his own. He'd collaborated on several other DreamWorks animations, but with other composers, for example, Hans Zimmer on Kung Fu Panda. This was the first time he went it alone. So adapted from Cressida Cowell's novel of the same name, and this subsequently has inspired a 3-film DreamWorks animated franchise. And How to Train Your Dragon is wonderful. It's a really good, rousing, stirring, emotional story about a Viking community called Burke and the ongoing conflict that they have with I know, right? It's a great name, isn't it?
Yeah, Burke. Yeah. It's one of those. They didn't focus group that in a UK, did they? No.
But it's a great. It's one of my favourite non-swear insult words. That Burke. Yeah. Burke. But it's interesting because I mean the word can also be ascribed to the main character called Hiccup, who's voiced by Jay Baruchel, who's a young Viking who absolutely is not into the whole dragon conflict thing. He's much more kind of timid. You know, he's not a big beefy Viking, unlike his father, who's voiced by Gerard Butler. Gerard Butler. He can't not do it again. Gerard Butler. Can I just say, actually, this is one of probably 3 films that I like Gerard Butler in, although he doesn't actually appear in it. He's actually his voice actually works really, really well for this character. Stoic the Vast is the name of the character. And then Hiccup it comes across a dragon that's been downed called Toothless, who might actually be the most adorable dragon in the history of cinema. He looks more like a cat. He's got like a kind of cat-like design to him. and a friendship forms, and it's all about how does this friendship transform the belief that humans and dragons need to be perpetually locked in conflict as enemies with each other. And it's a really, really wonderful film. It was a huge hit when it came out, and a lot of that is down to the spectacular nature of John Powell's score, which I said was Oscar nominated. Powell, as I said, had worked extensively in animation before on like Kung Fu Panda and Robots and Chicken Run, on which he collaborated with Harry Gregson Williams. But this was something else entirely. I mean, having listened to this again, the narrative flow in this score is brilliant. It's a really well considered score. It's really well put together. There's an opening track called This Is Burke, which is kind of the suite of all the main, well, there's two main themes. You've got the flying theme, which soars during the test drive track later on, which is just magnificent. But then you've got the kind of brass vocal theme, which is the sort of dragon fighting theme, the dragon conflict theme. And the way that these two themes are variously kind of woven around each other and deconstructed and presented in different arrangements is really quite amazing. There's a track called Forbidden Friendship, which has got this kind of dreamy Celtic New Age sound to it, which is very singular. And what it does is it offers a palate cleanser in amidst all the big roaring, like noisy action sequences, which put forward like bagpipes and choir and then so the difference between light and shades and the quiet moments and the louder moments in this score is really, really well done. And there is a real storytelling progression through the score. And as I've said, when you listen to a film score in its own terms, you want to be told, you want the narrative to be conveyed to you. And I think this score does it really tremendously well. All of the themes are brilliant, and they were subsequently developed to superb effect in the second and third scores as well. One need only think of the opening track, Dragon Racing, from How to Train Your Dragon 2, which is absolutely stupendous. Yeah, I love the way that Powell was loyal to the themes in this score. I love its sense of heart. It's a proper film score. It's got properly well-developed, memorable ideas to it, which strike a number of different tones. Yeah, I can't say enough good things about the score, and it was robbed of the Oscar. I'll be honest about that. It was robbed.
Yeah, what it lost to, we are going to cover on this episode, and I really do love that score for different reasons. But yeah, I think in terms of this being a sweeping, complex, really great piece of orchestration, it's a shame, because this is that classically sort of scored kind of animated movie. And yeah, and I only watched How to Train Your Dragon for this podcast, believe it or not. I missed it 10 years ago. I haven't seen it since. So I haven't seen the sequels yet, but I've heard the score, particularly for the third one, that came out last year, I think, didn't it? I mean, it's beautiful music, absolutely beautiful music. So I was fairly new to the film, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was very impressively done film that, a lot of non-Pixar animated films these days don't quite cut the mustard, but I think this pretty much gets there, even though it's DreamWorks, it's not that kind of perhaps top tier animation. And as a score, it definitely matches up. So yeah, I agree. I think it probably deserved it.
I mean, it's a story about inclusivity. It's a story that's got a very, very strong moral message to it, and it's not one of those annoying, superficial DreamWorks movies that drops in a lot of pop culture references that sort of have dated as soon as you leave the cinema. There's a lot of bad DreamWorks animation movies. It's not like that. I mean, the fact that it's got a historical setting precludes it from being able to do that, although it uses a lot of, American voice actors, contemporary American voice actors. You've got the likes of Jonah Hill and Kristen Wiig thrown in there as well. But it was an interesting thing to go back to what I was saying earlier about how certain composers that we're talking about today have become identified with a certain genre. In the years since John Powell has composed the first How to Train Your Dragon, he has almost exclusively worked in the realm of animation. I interviewed John Powell for Den of Geek. I think we might be able to put the interview in the show notes if people want to read it.
Yeah. What
he said to me was that he almost exclusively focuses on animation now because there is a wholesome, inspiring, feel-good, sort of morally pure element to those kinds of movies. And what he didn't like the fact that live-action Hollywood action movies were using violence as a kind of crutch to get out of storytelling problems. And I thought that was a very, very candid thing for him to say. And he likes the the moral purity of these kinds of movies. I mean, one can hear in all of the How to Train Your Dragon scores how thoroughly invested he is in it and how much heart and soul has been poured into it. And he's one of my favourite people to have interviewed, actually, although it was a very, very candid thing to admit the fact that there were whole tranches of the industry for which he had scored that he didn't like. And he's now kind of narrowed his focus. But I mean, if people want to check out my interview, they hopefully they can do that.
Yeah, we will. We'll add that to the show notes. Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Because be a good addition to hopefully listening to the music as well on the playlist if you haven't already. But I imagine a lot of people have listened to this score and already love it. So yeah, it's a good one to start off with. Absolutely. I'm going to move us into slightly different territory for my first one and talk about True Grit, the remake by the Coen brothers, with a score by Carter Burwell, their regular collaborator. And I mean, this it's a famous. Obviously, originally it was the John Wayne in the original playing Rooster Cogburn, the boozy lawman who is hired in this case by a 14-year-old farm girl, Mattie Ross, played by Hayley Steinfeld. I think it was her debut, actually, or it was the first film that really got her known. And they're chasing an outlaw who's killed her father, played by Josh Brolin. And this is set in around the late 19th century, so it's like the 1870s, I think, like that. So it's a very sort of period piece in that sense. And, I mean, I did see the first True Grit years ago, but it's one I need to go back and watch. But I did really love this film. I thought it was a really great adaptation of that and remake of that story, and it really swept me along. And I think the music had a big deal in terms of that, in terms of why, because I think it really does immerse you into this kind of very melodic, but also tragic American pastoral. And also, without it being fully church music, because that was something that they wanted to do, but it's not too intense. It's much more. I think they described it as wanting it to be a both. It couldn't be soothing or uplifting, and at the same time, it couldn't be outwardly depressing. I think that's what they've said. Carter Burwell has said, and that's the kind of balance it strikes. And obviously, it uses memorably the hymn from 1888, "Leaning on the Everlasting Arms," which immediately makes me think of The Night of the Hunter straight away.
Yes.
And Robert Mitchum's Leaning.
Oh, that's so scary. That is really terrifying.
It's brilliant. And that's one of my favourite films, Night of the Hunter. It's beaut. And I'd recommend, if you haven't seen The Night of the Hunter, guys, stop what you're doing, put this down, go and watch it. Basically. Because then when you come back and listen to True Grit, you'll think of that film. But yeah, I think it's lovely. I think there are points of real sort of danger and intensity, but there's so much of that. It really feels like you're on a journey in this sort of Old West setting with those balance of tempos. I mean, yeah, I think it's great. It's one of my favourite scores from this year.
Yeah, it is. It's really great. I mean, it's Carter Burwell and the Coen brothers have such a long-standing collaboration going way back to the likes of Raising Arizona in the late 80s. And I think Carter Burwell doesn't always get his due, because very often the scores that he writes for the Coen brothers are variously kind of quirky and somber, and they also incorporate other people's music as well, like this score does, and apparently that's why it was disqualified from the Oscars, this score. I mean, True Grit was nominated for lots and lots of Oscars, but the score wasn't one of them, which is a shame. But yeah, that's interesting that he talked about the Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. I read an interview with him where he said that the approach for the score was informed by directly by the biblical portent of the original book by Charles Portis, which the Coen brothers leaned on more heavily than the original John Wayne movie, because the John Wayne movie is just a kind of six-shooting, fairly hammy like western, isn't it? I mean, it's people regard it as a classic. I have to say it's not one of my favourite John Wayne films. I have to say I think this True Grit is one of the examples of where a remake is a lot better than the original. It's much this Coen brothers version is much more pragmatic and somber, and it's grounded in a much earthier kind of reality than the John Wayne one was. And I think the melancholy nature of the music with its sense of biblical reckoning is really great. There are other hymns apparently threaded throughout the score as well. It's a very, very beautiful score. I mean, it's interesting that the way that Carter Burwell takes other people's music and fashions it in the manner of a classic Western Odyssey. It's probably one of Burwell's most lyrically attractive scores. And certainly, I think the irony being that the Coen brothers are known for their unpredictability and for you not quite knowing where the rug is going to be pulled out from underneath you. And yet, ironically, this version of True Grit is probably one of their most straight-laced and outwardly entertaining films, which is a bit weird.
Yeah, that is strange. Yeah, yeah, that it were. Maybe it proves that they should try that a little bit more.
yeah.
Maybe, but yeah, I think you're right. I think it is a better remake. I think it's got a really good cast, and I just think Burwell's done some great stuff over the years. I mean, one I always read. It's not a Coen brothers film, and it's not necessarily a brilliant film, but the one I think the score that really made me remember him was probably the one I listened to when I was young, which was his score for Conspiracy Theory. Do you remember that film?
The Mel Gibson, yeah.
The Richard Donner film, Mel Gibson and Julia Roberts, and it was, the film's a bit hammy, but I loved that film as a kid. But the score's great. The Carter Burwell score, full of that kind of, and there's always the same kind. He's another one of those composers that you really know it's a Carter Burwell score because he has distinctive things going on, and you can hear that in True Grit, even though he does some really interesting, quite original stuff with that kind of hymn church sort of music, and which I think is great, and it makes this stand out even more. So yeah, I love this. This is an example of a score I think you can just kind of put on and have on, and it's just lovely music for the most part, and that's something that is a boon to it as well. So yeah, I really like this one. It's really good. I
suppose the one thing we should say is that it's a very, very powerful contrast with the Elmer Bernstein score from the original film. Obviously, we spoke about Elmer Bernstein on our previous episode, which people can go and check out. That was much more of a rousing Western score in the mould of the Magnificent Seven, and yeah, this is Carter Burwell's effort is much more of a somber, downbeat score, but arresting in its own sense.
Yeah, beautifully put there. Absolutely, can't think of a better way to describe that. Really, I think arresting is a good way to describe the next score in a very different way. And this is my favourite score of 2010. In fact, this might be one of my favourite scores of the 2010s, quite honestly, the entire decade. And I think this is held in high regard by a lot of people. So it's the score to Tron Legacy by Daft Punk, as you mentioned earlier. Perhaps the ultimate example of absolutely brilliant score, absolutely shite film.
Well, you see, the thing was that actually wasn't the example that I was thinking of at the very beginning of the episode. There's another film and another score that accompanies it on this list, which is worse. So
I agree with that. You're right. I don't necessarily think the score in that case is as good as this. But the film the Tron Legacy is slightly better, yeah, absolutely, than the other film on this list. But I suppose for me, this is just that example of how much you can sometimes get. And obviously this is a sequel, isn't it, to the 1982 Tron, the original. And in theory should have been a lot better than it was. But it's an example of really kind of duff film and just a fantastic score that just blows you away as soon as you listen to it.
The score is phenomenal. This was the debut score from Daft Punk, obviously. Thomas, a.k.a. Thomas Bangalter, and Guy Manuel de Homem Cristo, the helmeted sort of dance duo, who better known for like harder, better, faster, stronger. Perpetually on in the background, probably during my university years. Actually, lots of Daft Punk. I imagine it was the same for you, right? Daft Punk had this like omnipresent thing.
It was that song around the world, around the world. Dun, dun, dun. I can just see the video. I can see the video as I'm seeing that because it's just this geezer in like a helmet going around like blocks, isn't it? Like a circular block. Around the world. Okay, I'll stop
around the world. Almost turning into Owen Wilson. Around the world. Wow.
But yeah, definitely absolutely brilliant music from those guys.
I remember when this was announced, it's like Daft Punk are going to do a film score. That's very, very interesting. I mean, this was like the obviously directed by Joseph Kosinski, mega budget Disney sequel to, like you said, to the original Tron. Massively more expensive, lavishly staged. Was it's so sort of complex in terms of its visual effects that, like Avatar, pre-production started way in advance of the film's release, several years before. And it's interesting that Daft Punk were actually brought on very early in the pre-production stages, and they worked on this film for 2 years, which is very unusual for any film composer to get that length of time. Normally a film composer, one would imagine, with a healthy schedule would get a few months. Not in this case. They were given 2 years, so it's no wonder that the score is such a rich experience that mixes the symphonic orchestra, which apparently was recorded at Air Lyndhurst Studios in London, with the synthetic dance arrangements that one would expect from Daft Punk. One must also credit orchestrator Joseph Trapanese, who apparently was very, very pivotal in bridging the divide between Daft Punk's normal musical voice and the needs of a film score, with which they were not familiar. They'd not done anything like this before. Although apparently so Daft Punk had produced the soundtrack to the very, very controversial French film Irreversible, which was directed by Gaspar Noé, which was an incredibly brutal film, which had a very oppressive soundscape to it. Similar to How to Train Your Dragon, the reason why this score works is because it's composed of very, very memorable and very identifiable themes, building blocks. And although it traverses that organic and synthetic realm brilliantly, but the orchestra is at the heart of it. I think that's probably the thing that surprised me the most, because when you think of, Daft Punk are going to do a film score, you think it's going to sound almost entirely like that Around the World song that we just mentioned, but it doesn't sound like that. I mean, what it sounds like to me is it sounds like a cross between, appropriately enough, Wendy Carlos, who scored the original Tron, who was one of the synthetic film score pioneers, and somebody like Jerry Goldsmith, who in his own way crisscrossed the divide between the symphony orchestra and the electronic ensemble. It sounds like a cross between those two, and certainly you've got an incredibly beefy kind of brass led theme, which you first hear in the overture, which is very, very Jerry Goldsmith, but overlaid with all these shimmering synth effects, which are very Carlos. And the way that these principles extend throughout the rest of the score is really well done. It's really intelligently developed, and there are standalone tracks which do play more to Daft Punk's strengths. There's a track called De-Res, which you can imagine being on in a club, which is very kind of aggressive and pulse pounding and very electronic. There is another track called Solar Sailor, which is incredibly ambient and dreamy and and there's the word arresting. All of these different tones that the score managed to hit is very impressive for a Dave score. Very, very impressive. I mean, when you said that it's one of your favourite scores of the 2010s, I'm inclined to agree with you. Actually, I would agree with that. It's a really accomplished score.
I've just played it so often. Like I've had it on rotation over the last 10 years frequently, and I think it's just some incredible stuff on there. Like, I think my favourite is probably Flynn Lives towards the end, which is this incredibly rousing, building, heroic piece of music that is absolutely fantastic. Like there's and it's got such a varied mixture of that electronic stuff and that big brass kind of orchestral kind of thing going on, and it's a wonderful mix. It's one of the best mixtures of those kind of styles I think I've ever seen. And it's funny you should say about Goldsmith as well, because there is something that's out there on the internet which I have to point out and I have to talk about, which I found a couple of years ago, and I will put in the show notes. Somebody put together a condensed version of Star Trek The Motion Picture, which is scored by Jerry Goldsmith, and is my favourite film score of all time, as I may have mentioned on this podcast before. But they condensed it into like a 20-minute version of the motion picture set to the score to Tron Legacy. And it works brilliantly, Sean. I'll send you this. It's amazing how well this music works to that film. I can't say anymore. I'll put it in the show notes. It's called Star Trek Legacy. It's only on Vimeo, unfortunately. It's not on YouTube or anywhere like that. But I would encourage anyone. It's only got 20 minutes. It's amazing. So if anything proves that that link, I think that's it. Because I almost think you could port this music into all kinds of different films and it would work really well. I think it's not just based on Tron. It's really sort of universal, I think.
That's amazing. I didn't know about that. Yeah, please do send me that, because I imagine the hybrid mixture of the Tron Legacy score I can see that working brilliantly for an environment like Star Trek. Yeah. It's
so good. You know, because you've got the whole scenes of like when Spock goes on that spacewalk and he's going through Vija, and to Goldsmith's music, you've got all this wonderful, you know, ethereal sort of space music going on. But to this, you've got all the electronic sort of, and it's brilliant. It's so good. It's not as good as Goldsmith's original score. Nothing beats that for me. But I tell you what, I would absolutely lap up seeing the whole film set to this Tron Legacy score. I would. It is a masterpiece. I really do think this is a masterpiece of a score, and I think it would probably top my, if not top my scores of 2010 of the decade, then it would be up there. Yeah.
I mean, the way that it captures that sense of the organic, like the human being having gone into the virtual environment in the game, the organic and the virtual is really dramatically accomplished. The fact that they had 2 years to perfect it probably explains why the score is so good. Would that most film composers were able to hone and fine-tune their scores across that length of time, but that often doesn't happen because post-production schedules are often very, very stressful, very rushed. And I imagine they were helped in this instance because I think principal photography shot for about 2 months, but then the visual effects post-production I think took about 18 months, which is kind of, you know, almost not too dissimilar to what happened with Avatar. So therefore they had a lot of time to get the music right. And yeah, it's a masterful piece of work, Tron Legacy.
And speaking of Trapanese as well, I think I'd point anyone to his score. I think he was involved in the Tom Cruise film Oblivion, which is not a very good film, but the score to that's really good as well. And his score, his involvement, I think, particularly with the Raid Part 2, because there's some stunning stuff on there, which is absolutely brilliant. Really intense action music, but it's just amazing. So if you like this kind of stuff, go and investigate Joseph Trapanese as well, because he's got other stuff in the bank there. Okay, so my next one, moving on, is now that I was wondering about this when you've talked about the really rubbish film on this list. I think there's two, apart from Tron Legacy, which I think you maybe like a bit more than me, but I think it's a load of crap really. But there's two others that are really, really bad movies. Now I'm wondering which one you mean. So actually, no, tell a lie. There might be three, but there's definitely two. Now, is it the next one or is it the one that's coming later? Both by the same composer.
It's the one that's coming later.
Right, I thought maybe. Right,
although this one isn't very. This film isn't very good either. That we're about to talk about.
No, it's not. Okay, cool. So that's what I thought. So this one is The Tourist by James Newton Howard. Now, I don't know if anyone even really remembers The Tourist. Now, it's like it's Johnny Depp and Angelina Jolie in a kind of heisty James Bondy kind of espionage story. Directed by the brilliantly named Florian Henkel von Donnersmarck, which I don't even believe is a real name, but there you go. Right, it's like incredible. And it's a really sort of glossy, preppy kind of supposedly sexy kind of adventure, which is just a load of old wank, basically. It really is. It really is. It's just rubbish. I can't even remember a lot about it, to be honest. But I do remember how good the score was and how much better the score is than the movie. And apparently it was originally Gabriel Yared who was scoring this. And he does have one particular contribution, which is a piece called Dance in F towards the end of the film, which is really good. But I really think James Newton Howard did some great stuff on this. And I can see Yared doing a good job on this. I mean, he later did a beautiful score to a film called The Promise with Christian Bale, which I haven't seen the film, but the score is gorgeous. So I can see why he would be a good fit for this kind of exotic, aristocratic kind of spy caper movie. But yeah, Howard does a great job, and it's very different from the later score we're going to talk about, which we won't get into now. But I think it's a testament to how good a composer he is and how on fire he kind of is generally, that he's on this list twice, and he's the only one who's on this list twice.
Yeah, he's a very, very versatile composer. He's able to work through a host of different genres. Think of comedies like Dave, westerns like Wyatt Earp, big roaring action movies like Waterworld, period pastiche movies like Restoration. James Newton Howard is brilliant, and then there are the collaborations with M. Night Shyamalan that we'll get into shortly. Yeah. So you can sense the implicit thing there that I've just said.
Everybody knows what film we're going to talk about.
Yeah. I think that was the equivalent of a spoiler. Yeah, that was a spoiler, even though I didn't actually mention the name of the movie. I mean, the other thing with Newton Howard is that he can work very, very quickly. He's famous for that. He was brought in at the 11th hour on Peter Jackson's King Kong to replace Howard Shore, because Howard Shore was meant to do that. He then had creative differences with Peter Jackson. He walked. James Newton Howard was brought in with very little time and conjured a really terrific score for that. The Tourist, I mean, the best known for, I think, being roasted by Ricky Gervais at the Golden Globes that year, which was brutal, really brutal. And he ripped it in front of Johnny Depp. And apparently Johnny Depp, back at the point where Johnny Depp still had a sense of humour, then appeared on Life's Too Short, do you remember that when Johnny Depp appeared on Life's Too Short, and then they actually referred to Ricky Gervais being nasty to him and to his film. That is literally the only memorable thing about The Tourist. The fact that it's got one of the stupidest plot twists in living memory that I guessed within about the first 10 minutes. And then they try and spring that reveal on you. It's like, I was ahead of the game for the 100 minutes before this, and I was, not I want to sound smug, but the film is really dumb. And
it is. Yeah.
It's ridiculous, isn't it? And you think, okay, so you're trying to, and all the way through the movie, I was kind of thinking, no, the film can't be that stupid. I can't have guessed it that early on. And I was like, oh no, I am right.
It is. It is thick as shit.
It is
true.
that. Yeah. The film is as silly as I think it is. And frankly, it didn't deserve the involvement of either Gabriel Yared or James Newton Howard, both of whom are so far above this kind of material. It's a testament to James Newton Howard that he is able to invest it with as much dignity as he does. I think a lot of it is very much James Newton Howard doing a John Powell impression with a lot of synthetic percussion and sort of choppy strings, which actually, when I listened to the score for The Tourist again, did remind me of Newton Howard's other score for 2010, which was Salts, which was the other Angelina Jolie movie.
Oh my god, that film! Can I just tell you this? Right, I went to see that film with a friend of mine, and I mean that film's bobbins as well. But we went to see that film, and there's a scene in that film that I will never forget where Angelina Jolie goes to this apartment that's been burgled or something like that, and there's a guy there and she's having a conversation with him, and all his books have been cast on the floor, and he picks one up. She picks one up. She looks it over, and the title of it is in big capital letters, "Spiders!" with an exclamation mark. And I remember me and my friend just cried for about 10 minutes, and then all we did for about a year to each other was go, "Spiders!" like that.
Is that because her husband in the film is an arachnid expert? I don't remember that detail at all. I do not. I'm gonna have to go and watch it again now just to keep an eye out for that. That's amazing.
I think he's some sort of arachnid guy. Yeah. He's got a book just called Spiders. I mean. That is worth. It's worth salty's crap, but it's worth it for that one scene, basically. But anyway,
there's Hollywood shorthand, isn't there? There's Hollywood shorthand, and then there's that, which is just ridiculous. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, again, James Newton Howard didn't have a particularly good year in 2010, did he? I mean, 3 films, the third of which we're yet to talk about, none of which really deserved his talents, but he went above and beyond for all of them. And to take it back to The Tourist, a lot of it is very much a kind of lightweight John Powell, lots of jumpy electronics, and there are a lot of sort of choppy ostinato string arrangements, which again is what reminded me of Salt, albeit in this instance done in a much more comic realm. The main memorable feature of the score is the love theme, which is gorgeous. I understand probably why you like the score so much, because this love theme, the lilting theme with the accordion arrangement, although the film is set in Venice, not in Paris, but that is really beautiful, and the loyalty to that is really well done, and the use of it during the final reveal, which is meant to have a kind of ironically romantic effect because the music is meant to play against what you're watching, and all it makes me think is, my god, the music is great, the film is an absolute dog. It's just like,
it is.
And I can't believe it's from the director of The Lives of Others. The Lives of Others was an incredible film, sort of controversially nabbed the foreign language film Oscar from Pan's Labyrinth, but that is a really terrific film. I think that was scored by Gabriel Yared, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, I mean, it shows, as I said at the very beginning of this, film composers are remarkable for looking beyond the garbage that's being presented to them and thinking, right, I have to find inspiration for this. And they go above and beyond the Call of Duty. Again, to mention Jerry Goldsmith. Jerry Goldsmith was the master at doing that. And James Newton Howard similarly has done it many, many times throughout his career. But yeah, a charming little score, I'd say.
Yeah, I really like it. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good description of it, really. Charming in a different way, I suppose, but maybe in a bit more of a sinister way is the next one for you. So you've gone for The Ghostwriter from Alexandre Desplat. And this is obviously an adaptation of the book by Robert Harris, The Ghost, and it's a political thriller directed by Roman Polanski, starring Pierce Brosnan. I'm a big fan of Robert Harris. I've got all his books. I've loved him for years. He's writing, but I don't know if this film was a really particularly good adaptation of that book, and. But the score, I think, is and it's the first time I've listened to it in years, probably in about nearly 10 years since this was out, and the score's great.
It's really terrific, isn't it? It's really atmospheric, and it's Desplat is a brilliantly creative musician. What I love about this is the way that it takes that, it's a bit of a cliche, that Bernard Herrmann-esque sense of burbling menace, lots of choppy strings that propel you along, but the instrumental colours that he uses in this score, particularly the use of the bassoons in the lower registers, like the bassoon is used as a propulsive element through the main theme, and it almost gives it a kind of blackly comic, like quirky feel to it, which is very, very dangerous tightrope to walk, because what you think is you're at the risk of undermining what is a film with nominally a serious intent. The idea that Ewan McGregor is the ghostwriter, he's gone to compile the memoirs of the British PM Pierce Brosnan, who's really good. Pierce Brosnan is really good in this, really smarmy and creepy, and obviously not to be trusted. There were rumours that he was based on Tony Blair, although I think Pierce Brosnan played that down. And the score walks that very fine line between brilliantly accentuating the menace, but also playing up that very mordant Roman Polanski sense of humour, because Roman Polanski has got, famous for that kind of slightly sadistic humour in a lot of his films, the way that he toys with his characters. You think of things like Rosemary's Baby with that sense of paranoia, and Desplat plays that up because you're not quite sure whether Ewan McGregor is just a complete fish out of water, or if there is actually something going on, if there is a conspiracy going on. And the way the score uses these instrumental colours to keep you off balance throughout, should I be darkly amused at the main character's plight, or should I be genuinely scared about what's going on, is a very difficult thing to pull off. And I think he does it with a real amount of style in this, and there are some terrific action sequences. There's the chase on the ferry scene with some phenomenal string writing in it, which is amazing. I mean, in that sense, it anticipates a Desplat score that we're not going to be talking about today, actually, which is Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1, which also came out in 2010. And I think when you can hear a lot of the stylistics of the Ghostwriter in that score, because that's obviously a much darker Harry Potter score, and Deathly Hallows Part 2 as well. He's a fabulous composer. The way that this film could have been scored in a very, very generic, plodding orchestral synth mix, and he doesn't do that. It's very well mixed. You can hear the various facets of the orchestra all playing off each other to variously kind of quirky and threatening effect. Yeah, one of the finest thriller scores of the last 10 years, easily.
Yeah, and I feel like there have been like countless films kind of like this. I mean, one I watched recently was Official Secrets with Keira Knightley, which is it's all right, you know, it's okay, not a bad film. But the score there's nothing. It just fades away into the background. Like there's no real interest there, and it feels like there's been all kinds of films that are along this sort of political thriller bent, where a lot of the scores have just been very bland and have just sort of barely been around. But this one really, he goes to town. You know, he has real fun, like you say, creating that sort of Herman-esque, sort of dark world, sort of twisted aspect to it that's playful and sinister. And it's like a whirligig of all these different things. It's great. You know, it's a lot of fun to listen to, independent of the film, even though the film is just not very good, really. And I would say for me anyway, I just don't think it's as good as the book. Personally, I'd recommend anyone read the book.
I really like the film. I think the film is. Again, having not read the book, that's probably why I like the film, because I'm not measuring the two up against each other. But I do like the claustrophobic atmosphere of the film, and also another Desplat instrumental choice, the use of the chimes and the xylophones to create that sort of tinkling sense of like, okay, what's actually going on here at the heart of the story, and it creates that sense of uncertainty. I think the marriage of visuals and music in this instance is really, really great.
Yeah, maybe I'll go back and revisit it. Maybe it's one to look back on. So, yeah, on to my next one then. I've gone for probably one of the most famous films from this year, The Social Network by David Fincher, scored by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, which obviously it tells the story of the creation of Facebook and stars Andrew Garfield and Jesse Eisenberg, and focusing on Mark Zuckerberg and the origins of this all-dominant social media platform. And in fact, on my other podcast, Motion Pictures, it's the 10-year anniversary of The Social Network coming up, and I think we're going to do an episode about The Social Network, because it's going to be fascinating to go back and watch that now, 10 years on, given what Facebook has become in the last 10 years, and given the role Zuckerberg now has in the world as this extremely controversial, divisive, not even divisive, I think he's just controversial, tech giant. It will be interesting to look back on this film. But I think, because I haven't seen it in years, but I've always really liked the score, and I think like Reznor and Ross, they've gone on to do loads of different things, haven't they? Most recently, they did brilliant work, I think, on HBO's Watchmen series. They are potentially a bit of a Marmite sort of combination, you know. Obviously, Trent Reznor's from Nine Inch Nails, so he's got that, you know, background in this sort of electronic rock kind of thing, and I think that they've brought this. I mean, they did a brilliant score, I think, for The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, which I love that film by David Fincher, the year before, I think, or the year after, maybe. And then, they scored Gone Girl and various other things. But so I'm a big fan of theirs. But I can understand why maybe people might not be drawn to The Social Network, even though obviously it won the best original score at the Oscars that year. I don't know. I'm going to guess, Sean, that you're not as big a fan of this probably as me.
I'm going to surprise you. I'm actually more a fan of it now than I was 10 years ago. So just to, we were talking about the passage of time at the very beginning of this podcast, about how time can shape your attitudes towards certain things. And 10 years ago, when I was less knowledgeable about this subject, my general attitude was if a film score isn't in the symphonic realm, it can't have that much value. And subsequently, in the 10 years since, I've come to appreciate the fact that film scores are very amorphous. They can take on many different styles, many different tones, and they don't need to be symphonically oriented. I mean, to go back to John Powell, he said that there's just as much artistry in the works of Aretha Franklin as there is in Beethoven's Ninth. That's one of the quotes from my interview that I did with him, and I think that. Much as I might have appreciated Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross's work on The Social Network at the time, I was actually really annoyed that it won the Oscar. I am still kind of annoyed that it won the Oscar, to be honest. But in the 10 years since, and having watched the film again recently and having listened to the score on its own terms again recently, I can really appreciate what an achievement this is. I mean, the film is astonishing. The film is brilliant. I'd call it one of the best films of the last decade. I really love David Fincher's style. And interestingly, these two guys are now working on David Fincher's next film, which is Mank, which is about the screenwriter of Citizen Kane.
Yeah. That's coming out soon, isn't it? I think
very soon, in the next couple of months, I think.
Yeah, can't wait for that.
Yeah, likewise. And I think they're also working on Pixar's new movie, Soul, which is very interesting. That's not something they've done before. They've never worked in the family-friendly realm. So they are becoming increasingly versatile. But there is a house style, or there was a house style set down by the score for The Social Network, because Trent Reznor hadn't done a film score prior to this, as far as I'm aware. Atticus Ross had. And it's interesting looking up the history of The Social Network score. Trent Reznor didn't want to do it because he'd just come off a tour, and David Fincher held out for him, and then Trent Reznor eventually agreed. And what you get is, I think, a score that does a very, very good job of mixing, in almost not too dissimilar to Tron Legacy, a sense of organic humanity with these kind of buzzing electronic impulses that speak of a very calculating, ruthless personality. So you've got something ultimately compassionate and kind of cold and dark. They're fighting with each other at the centre of this score, which is brilliant for embodying the character of Mark Zuckerberg himself, brilliantly played by Jesse Eisenberg. I think the music does a tremendous job of getting underneath the skin of that character. And I remember when watching the film 10 years ago, when it came out in the cinema, I'm being absolutely blown away by it. And the opening scene, which is accompanied by a track called Hand Covers Bruise, which is the first bit of music that you hear in the film from Reznor and Ross. There is a piano motif. It's not really a theme. It's a motif that never really resolves itself. It just kind of fades, and then it's laid over all these kind of ominous, like, buzzing electronic effects. And what you get is the sense of a character on the cusp of something. The fact is, at the beginning of the movie, he has been dumped by Rooney Mara's character. He's drunk, and then he translates that misogynist rage into a website that becomes the Facebook, and then ultimately Facebook. Although, you know, one should say that Aaron Sorkin's script, I think, takes a lot of liberties with the truth, but one can imagine there is an emotional truth underlining it. And given the way that Mark Zuckerberg has come across in the news in the last 10 years, I think the portrayal of him in the film probably isn't that far away from the truth, to be completely honest. But the sense of, in the music, in the opening sequence, of a character whose sort of good and bad sides are competing with themselves, and who will translate that naivety and misogyny into something that will ultimately create a website that will change the entire world. The way the music gets that is brilliant. I think it's really well done, and I learned to appreciate more as well the various electronic effects throughout the score. I mean, a lot of it reminded me in some ways of like an 8-bit video game score.
Yeah.
Did you think that as well?
Yeah, I can see what you mean now. Yeah, there's definitely points where it has those beep, beep, boop, boop, boop kind of things going on. Definitely, yeah, like a platformer. Yeah, and I think that I would be surprised if that wasn't a dramatic device, because the whole thing about the film was that it's got in a weird way, it's kind of a period film, but it's a period film that starts in 2003, so it's not that long ago. Although relative to where we are now, 2003 might as well be in another century. Might as well be in another time zone altogether. And the world of 2003 was very, very different in terms of, we didn't have social networking at that point. The internet was still relatively crude. I mean, I think probably dial-up internet was probably still just about being phased out by that point. And the somewhat sort of analog electronic nature of the score, the fact that it does sound like an 8-bit score, I think that was probably deliberate. It's a more innocent electronic age back in 2003 than what we've got now. And I mean, one should also mention the in the Hall of the Mountain King, the electronic adaptation of the Peer Gynt that they do as well during the Henley boat race sequence, which is great. Apparently that was a direct instruction from David Fincher that he wanted them to score it in the manner of Wendy Carlos, again to take it back to Tron. I
appreciate the nuances of this score a lot more now than I did 10 years ago. It didn't deserve the Oscar over How to Train Your Dragon, I don't think, but it's still very impressive.
Well, I've just looked up the 5 nominees. So it beat How to Train Your Dragon, as you say. It beat 127 Hours by A.R. Rahman, which I watched that not so long back, actually, a couple of weeks ago.
That's a lovely score.
It didn't really stand out to me a vast amount, if I'm honest. So maybe it's one I need to listen to independently. But yeah, and then Inception, which by Hans Zimmer, which I'm surprised didn't win in a way, and The King's Speech by Alexandre Desplat, which I think is a great score as well. So yeah, it's a strong category, really. Quite a lot of really good pieces of music on there. So. And quite different, some of them quite different. But maybe it was just because The Social Network was such a big movie and maybe considered such an important movie. I mean, it was nominated for lots of other Oscars, and it didn't really win much else. It won Best Adapted Screenplay, Aaron Sorkin. But, Fincher didn't win. It didn't win Best Picture. So maybe they were like, well, we need to give it a bit more. Let's throw this at it.
I mean, I think probably what it is, because so much of the film is about people typing, people coding, people... It's often said that one of the least cinematic things you can do is show somebody at a computer, although obviously lots of films have had to do that. And I think the way that Reznor and Ross get under the skin of that, and they musically accompany the impulses that are behind that typing, is probably maybe what the Oscars saw in it. I mean, it's a phenomenal film, and I think it is given another layer of personality by the music, another layer of very complex, prickly personality by the music. It's superb.
It's very good, yeah, absolutely. Speaking of superb, let's go back to the well of let's go back to the well of James Newton Howard. Let's not go back to the well of the film, because in this case, Avatar: The Last Airbender is about as far away from superb a film as you could possibly imagine. However, the score is... I mean, I've seen the film once, which obviously is more than enough. but the score, I'd forgotten how good it was, and I listened to it individually, and I was like, wow, this is terrific stuff.
Best score ever written for a truly dreadful film, I would say. I mean,
it could be, yeah.
But I'd put it up there. I mean, you could put any number of Jerry Goldsmith's scores up there, because he wrote some absolutely terrible films as well. But yeah, so The Last Airbender, adapted from the Nickelodeon series, was such a disaster that apparently it killed off any other attempt to revitalise the Nickelodeon series. That's how bad the film was. Because it offended and annoyed both fans of the series and also people like me who just walked in casually and went, what the fuck is this? Because it's just like... That's exactly
it. Yeah, everyone went, what is this drivel that we are watching?
Yeah, and then astonishingly, M. Night Shyamalan has been allowed to continue to make films in the wake of this. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I mean, I would.
But he's actually made better. He's
done good stuff.
He's done all right. Like the Visit was okay. The Glass I thought was really quite good. So he's starting to get back into it now. But yeah, this. It's a wonder he got anything after this. Definitely.
I know he's genuinely jaw-dropping, and what's also jaw-dropping is the fact that James Newton Howard somehow looked beyond what he was being presented with, or perhaps it was because what he was being presented with was so dire that he thought, I really need to strain and I really need to stretch myself to give this movie the grandiosity that M. Night Shyamalan thinks it has, which it clearly doesn't. So I mean, any movie in which you've got lines like, from birth I always knew you were destined to be a bender, I mean, it's just like, I mean, for goodness sake, I mean, obviously it's a movie it's a Hollywood movie, so clearly that was lost in translation, so you can't entirely blame them for that. But I remember that was quoted everywhere when the film came out over here, that line embodied how bad the film was. I think Peter Bradshaw in The Guardian might have cited it. And
apparently the full line is this, because I've just found it.
Yeah.
I knew from the first time I discovered you were a bender that you would realise your destiny.
So the line is actually even worse than I remember it being. So I was actually being soft on it there. I actually gave like my own interpretation of it. So blimey, this film is bad. I mean, it's just, I mean, it costs apparently like 200 million. It looks outrageously cheap. I mean, there is literally a set piece in which someone waves their arms around, lifts bits of CGI earth off the ground and flings it in people's faces. I mean, I'm like, come on. Like, just, and M. Night Shyamalan has got this really portentous way of, you know, in order to convey something, I will talk increasingly slowly. Like that is the way that M. Night Shyamalan directs actors. Like, sometimes he gets away with it in The Sixth Sense, which is a tremendous film and a great score from James Newton Howard. Other times like this, it's an absolute sort of shrieking disaster. And I just think that James Newton Howard is some kind of a genius for being able to come up with a score this good, because what you have is a symphonic masterpiece in which, appropriately enough, given the mystical Far Eastern inflected setting of it, you have a lot of emphasis on bowls and chimes and the erhu, which is a stringed instrument, which gives a really ethereal sense of beauty. So very, very harmonically rich score, brilliantly mixed by Sean Murphy, who's one of the best mixers in the business. He worked on Jurassic Park and many other scores. But you also have a strong thematic base. I mean, you have like a 2-note, almost like quest theme, because the idea is that these two very annoying central characters have to go and find another really annoying character who can control all 4 elements. And then he is the eponymous Airbender. And so that 2-note theme propels the story forward, but then alongside that you have the emergent Airbender theme, which has just got this sense of grandiose, portentous weight. It might be the best thing that Newton Howard's ever done, and its emergence in the Flow Like Water cue, that might be the single greatest track of Newton Howard's career, and blimey, that's saying something. And blimey, is it saying something when you see how bad the film is. It's really quite astonishing.
Can I just be really, really pretentious and indulgent and quote myself, because when I wrote,
we're doing that now, are we? We're doing that.
Yeah, we've gone that far. This has taken us that far. This was my Letterboxd review like 6 years ago when I reviewed this. It's not a long review, but this, I described it as this: wide-eyed, gawping, chewing scenery, this is the cast, like they're in an episode of Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, only without knowing it's a comedy.
That's perfect.
I'm actually quite proud of that. Yeah, I think that's pretty on the money there.
That is absolutely spot on. I couldn't think of a better way of doing that. And when you put James Newton Howard's extraordinary score over it, the score on its own terms is remarkable, but it makes the film more silly because, somewhat perversely, actually, if we're doing that, can I just to briefly go back to The Tourist, because there is a James Newton Howard link here. I believe I described The Tourist, which is The Tourist was meant to have been riffing on the whole Cary Grant, Audrey Hepburn kind of like charade kind of thing. So I described The Tourist not so much Cary Grant as Cary Can't, which I was quite pleased with. So there was a review I did for that. So
hey, look, you know, we've gone down this rabbit hole now. We might as well be as pretentious as hell and quote how great we are, you know, and how witty we are.
I mean, I think if we're going to do pretentious, we need to call up M. Night Shyamalan and sort of do something for this podcast, like maybe get him to do like the portentous voiceover or something. But actually, no, let's not do that. No. But James Newton Howard, a genius. This is probably the best score that's ever been written for a bad movie. It's really beautifully mixed, really detailed, really strong thematic ideas. There's another kind of percussive brass theme for the Fire Nation, which is the more warmongering bad guys in the film, as exemplified by Dev Patel, who apparently was really embarrassed to be in the movie. There was an interview with him in which he actually went and apologised to fans of the TV series because he recognised what an absolute travesty of a film it was. So yeah, it's just...
Well, thankfully he's gone on to much bigger and better things now, like David Copperfield, which I watched the other day, and just
that's lovely, really lovely
he's so
film.
Good in that. Yeah, so, you know, he's survived intact, really, but, you know, which is good. But yeah, the film is just staggeringly bad. Like, I mean, I remember Tron Legacy being rubbish, but I mean, that is Citizen Kane compared to this. You know what I mean? This is, I mean, it's one of those things where it's one of those films that is a bit, I suppose, a bit like Battlefield Earth. You truly have to watch it to understand how terrible it is. And do you know what? I do genuinely often think, Sean, that watching films like this is good. It's good for people, because when you're able to watch something like this, you truly understand what a great movie then is. Because if you've seen the worst and you've seen the absolute, especially when it's big budget like this and hundreds of millions or whatever have been thrown at it, and then something so terrible on every level is made, it allows you to appreciate when you get a truly great piece of cinema. I really would say to anybody, don't always avoid terrible films, because it's a good thing to watch them. And like you say, sometimes you get a dynamite score with it.
I say this to people so often. I'm so glad you've said that. They're like, why did you go and see that film? Like, I went to go and see it in order to contextualise what a really good film is. I'm completely with you on that. The problem with this film is that very often with a bad film, you'll laugh at it because it's so cheesy. The problem is this is a terrible film that takes itself very, very seriously, as so many of Shyamalan's films do. So you don't even laugh at it. You sit there in sort of stupefied boredom, thinking, like, how on earth? Like, would it have killed them to have thrown in a few jokes? Like, M. Night Shyamalan doesn't do that. But I mean, I will say, he has elicited fine scores from James Newton Howard pretty consistently on all the films. They haven't worked together recently, but you think of scores like The Village with its wavering like fiddle solos. The Village is a lovely score, and menacing as well. Yes,
Unbreakable is a masterpiece of a score. I love that score.
That's brilliant. And I mean, Lady in the Water with its sort of glassy choral accents, which I think was described by more than one critic as a damp plop of a film. It's like, have we been mean enough to M. Night Shyamalan yet? I don't know if we have.
Well, we should just stop now before we start calling him what Mark Kermode calls him, M. Night Shame about the last film.
That's very good.
Which, as I say, isn't necessarily true anymore, because I think the last 3 films he's made have been pretty good, really. I could say, I thought Glass was surprisingly good. Split was pretty decent. And I was disappointed, actually, that James Newton Howard didn't come back and score the other 2 of the Unbreakable trilogy films, as it's turned out now. Because I think he'd have done amazing stuff on Glass. You could have had... Because you did get some of the, the Mr. Glass theme running through that and everything, but it wasn't as good. It was not as good as what James Newton Howard would have done. So it's a shame, really, that the budget didn't stretch, or, he was too busy or whatever. Because to have an Unbreakable trilogy in that sense would have been fantastic from him. But... there you go. We've at least got The Last Airbender, which is a brilliant score. So definitely.
Let's let that particular fart waft out of the room now, shall we? Let's just get rid of it.
But definitely go and listen to the score, because the score is fab. Absolutely. Just never ever watch the film ever. Trust me. Do watch it, and then you'll know what a great film is. Anyway, as we've said. Moving on to a better film, to be fair. This one's a quieter, perhaps less well-known film, Never Let Me Go, scored by Rachel Portman. This is the film directed by Mark Romanek, written by Alex Garland from Kazuo Ishiguro's novel, so quite a pedigree involved there, really. Stars Kerry Mulligan, Keira Knightley, Andrew Garfield, again, really good cast. It's a strange film. It's kind of like, it's sort of about a sort of a love triangle between these characters, but it's a little bit sci-fi. It's sort of that. I don't want to say too much in case people haven't seen it, but there's stuff about like life extension, clones, but it's not a big science fiction story. It's much more of a strange romance, which I suppose fits sort of Ishiguro's kind of the way he does things. But I think Rachel Portman's score for this is beautiful. It's a really lovely melodic piece that I think really taps into those themes about that kind of romantic attachment, and hints maybe a little bit at the more sci-fi ideas going on in there.
I'm really glad you picked this film, because I think this is a tremendously underrated film and a brilliant one as well.
It's a good film, yeah.
It's really, really good. It's a really good adaptation of the novel, although there are certain things that are changed about it. Yeah, I think that you're right. It's a sci-fi film without the sci-fi trappings, and it's got a kind of quaint, like oldie worldy analog atmosphere with a limited number of locations and a limited number of cast members, all of whom I have to say are terrific. Carey Mulligan and Andrew Garfield are unsurprisingly brilliant. The real standout is Keira Knightley, who I remember watching Keira Knightley in this at a point where I was still a little bit cynical about her acting abilities. I thought, wow, I'm going to have to stop doing that now, because she's really good as this brittle, not altogether pleasant character in it, quite bitter. And the score is, as you said, very, very important. As I said, the movie has got an analog, organic sensibility. You get a sense of the appalling fate that is awaiting the three characters in the film. I won't give away what it is for those who haven't seen it, but there is a sense of portent and reckoning, the fact that these three young people, played by the various actors that I've just cited, are on course for a dreadful fate. But the environment in which they operate is very normal. There are a lot of the beginning of the film takes place at a big country school, which could be ripped straight from the life as we know it. There are also various sequences filmed in the countryside. There's a sequence filmed at Clevedon Pier, which is a beautiful pier. I live in Bristol. That's not far away from me. And it's a lovely spot. So it's a recognisable world, yet an unrecognisable world at the same time, because you get a sense there is something going on in the background that is appalling, but you can't quite get a bead on it until it's too late. And the score is breathtaking. I mean, Rachel Portman, I believe, was the first woman to win an Oscar, I think for Emma, back in 1996. And she's got a very, very clearly defined house style, very elegant, very classical, very British, I think very English, probably more specifically. Definitely working in the realm, coming off the realm of the likes of Vaughan Williams and masters like that. And one can hear that in scores for like Emma and the Cider House Rules and things like that. But what I love about this score is that it's much more, whereas Rachel Portman's scores are very often quite cheerful and quite optimistic, this is much more melancholy. I think it's a lot darker, and I think it's got more weight to it. It is purely about suggesting the awful fate that is awaiting the characters, and there's a lot of emphasis on low register kind of cello and double bass arrangements, which is kind of overwhelmingly sad. I mean, I did read a few criticisms of the score that maybe the music tells you too much. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think that the score has an operatic sensibility that is very well tailored to the movie, and credit to Mark Romanek for eliciting such a fine score. And there is, in the climactic scene, again, I won't give away the particulars of it, there is a track called We All Complete, which just reaches this crescendo of just sadness, with Carey Mulligan giving a really, really fabulous performance. So yeah, I'm really glad you picked this. I forgot this was a 2010 film, actually. I might have seen it early on in 2011, so I might not actually have seen this in 2010. I might have seen it a couple of months later. But yeah, really great choice.
I think it did open here in the very start of 2011, to be fair. I think it had a limited release in the US in the autumn of 2010. So we didn't see this quite in 2010 itself, but it's a 2010 movie, so hence why I thought I'd throw it in there. But it's one I need to watch again. And I need to read the novel. I think my wife's got the novel because she's got quite a bit of Ishiguro. So I need to read the novel and then watch the film again, because it's been some years. But it is a beautiful piece of music, absolutely. So your last choice is, again, another film I would say is a bit rubbish, but has a really good score. You've gone for a theme here in some of your choices. But this one isn't as bad as The Last Airbender. This is Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, the first one, with a score, obviously, by Danny Elfman. And I mean, this is all a little bit, it's pointless even trying to describe this in detail. Everybody knows the story of Alice in Wonderland. And everybody knows, really, that if Tim Burton's going to do a movie, pretty much you're guaranteed Danny Elfman is going to score it. Even, going back to, Edward Scissorhands onwards, and those kind of films. And they've done so many fantastic collaborations together, even when maybe Burton's films, because I really do think Tim Burton is a Marmite filmmaker. I think sometimes he's great, sometimes he's terrible. And quite often, actually, he's in the middle, quite frankly. He's quite average. But he is unique, and the music that he's conjured for his films is deliberately fantastical and whimsical. And, again, Danny Elfman is one of those composers who, a Danny Elfman score, and when you get a Danny Elfman and Tim Burton collaboration, you're pretty much guaranteed it's going to be pretty good, I think. And I'd say this is no exception.
Yeah, and one need only play a few bars of a Danny Elfman score, and you'd recognise it as a Danny Elfman score. There is an emphasis on certain instrumental stylistics like chimes, a choir. I mean, you don't get a Danny Elfman score without a choir. They go together like ham and eggs. You know, it's kind of that they are linked. Very, very almost sort of fairy tale prancing, like brass rhythms, string rhythms, all very, very singular, as you said, going back to the likes of Edward Scissorhands and Batman. Obviously before that, I mean, to things like Pee-wee's Big Adventure and Beetlejuice and things. When you said that Alice in Wonderland perhaps isn't quite as bad as The Last Airbender, I'll tell you what, it's not far off. It's
I'm being generous.
You are being generous, because I'm generally a big fan of Tim Burton, but I thought this was a complete mess of a film. I really didn't like it at all, and it's very depressing that it took something like $1 billion at the box office. And at the time, I believe it became like the 5th highest grossing movie of all time. I was like, my God, that's miserable news. All the other superior films that deserve to claim that success, and this is up there. What I really didn't like about it was that it didn't have that practical tactility that you would expect from a Tim Burton movie. The thing about Tim Burton movies is that Tim Burton creates worlds that are practical and organic, or at least he did up until a certain point. You think of the forest in Sleepy Hollow, all of that was done on a set. There was no green screen. And you think how brilliantly immersive and terrifying Sleepy Hollow was. You think of the cookie factory in Edward Scissorhands with all the robots, the faces going up and down. There's often a whimsy to Tim Burton's film. There was no whimsy in this. There was just this horrible sort of green screen CGI just slathered all over everything. And I was watching it thinking, am I watching a George Lucas movie? I actually did, and that's not a good thing. And I thought it was just visually ugly. It was way, way too busy in terms of its visual effects. There are so many visual effects that I became numb to it, and the movie ceased to have any kind of magic whatsoever. And I think that it's not that I want to turn this into a diatribe against the movie, because I understand that we are here to talk about the music, but I'll get to that. And I believe, I can't remember who it was who wrote a review for it, was that it's the biggest affront to Lewis Carroll and nonsense literature, precisely because the film makes sense. And that is it. That is exactly it. The whole point of Alice in Wonderland, the original source, was that it was nonsense literature. It was meant to be befuddling and confounding, but there was some kind of an emotional truth that you had to read between the lines to try and get. Whereas what Tim Burton does with this is he creates a saviour narrative in which you have a girl, played by Mia Wasikowska, who disappears down the rabbit hole and follows the most kind of bog-standard Hollywood art to become a kind of sword-swinging heroine. And I just think that is it. That is why it doesn't work. It betrays the essence of the storyline, and it betrays the essence of the source material. So again, like James Newton Howard, full credit to Danny Elfman for looking beyond the nonsense that he was presented with, and for actually conjuring a score that is spectacular. I think it's one of Danny Elfman's best scores for Tim Burton. Again, it runs completely contrary to the quality of the movie, which is one of the ironies. What Danny Elfman does really superbly is he honours the spirit of Lewis Carroll better than Tim Burton does, because the main theme for Alice is a vocal performance. It's a poem that is sung by a boys' choir, which is adorned by the usual Danny Elfman, like brass, strings, xylophone, pipe organ. But there is a choir that sings about Alice's destiny. And that theme is then deconstructed throughout the rest of the score. You get fragments of it, either standalone fragments or bits of it that are incorporated into music that's variously abstract and weird. You think of the whole like Drink Me sequence, which has got a kind of Indian sitar vibe to it. All the scenes with the caterpillar voiced by Alan Rickman, which are kind of woozy and strange. But then you've got some real blustering action sequences, which are very much in the modern day Danny Elfman post Planet of the Apes mold. He's a really good action composer. I mean, he's obviously done the likes of Spider-Man and things, and Batman. But yeah, the score is terrific. It's like House Train Your Dragon. It's got a clutch of central ideas that are really well developed. Although in this instance, I think this score is more of a one theme score, and what you can do with that theme, and it communicates more emotional purity than the visuals do, which I think is odd. And I'm kind of at a loss to explain why that often happens in film music. Why is it that I can appreciate the music on its own terms, and I might just be able to appreciate the music in context of the film, yet I end up hating the film as well? It's really weird.
I just think it just proves that you can't always. The two don't always marry together. You don't always just get an amazing score that fits a brilliant movie. And as we've said a few times in this episode, and I think everything you've said really about this, I'd agree with. To be honest, I think the whole Alice in Wonderland, and I don't even think I bothered watching the sequel. Look Through the Looking Glass. I don't even think I could be asked, because I thought it's going to be the same. It's going to be much the same, isn't it? Really, and it's just that kind of. I get the same kind of vibe with the Pirates of the Caribbean films. It's just that grim, heavy CGI, unfunny, narratively all over the shop, kind of overblown rubbish, when you could do something much, much more interesting and focused and, better written, ultimately, from the ground up. Because, Burton's a visual stylist in many ways. The way he creates his worlds is fascinating, but in terms of this... Yeah, it's too artificial. It's too, and it just doesn't come alive in any way.
What it is, it's sterile. It's really sterile, and it's airless. And yet the irony of the score is very organic. The score is very rich. It's got a real harmonic sense. Again, like all the other scores mentioned, it's really well mixed. And the dynamic mixture between the various vocal arrangements, be they kind of sung choir or a sung poem, and then the pipe organ and the strings, and the mixture between music that's variously attractive and thrilling, threatening, whatever, is really well done. That just it's completely counterintuitive to the plasticized nature of the film itself, which is really weird. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the Honest Trailers channel from Screen Junkies. I don't know if you've seen that. They do narrated takedowns of great films. Some of the films they take down in really savage fashion. Some of the films are celebrated, but in the case of Alice in Wonderland, they really took it to task. And John Bailey does the voiceover where he goes, roll your eyes at the world's least inspired casting choice as Johnny Depp plays a pasty weirdo. And it's kind of like that. That is it. That is exactly it.
Isn't it? Yeah. That's exactly what it is. He's just become a walking cliche of himself, Johnny Depp. It's a shame. And that's the thing. It's just... Yeah. So this film is no good, but great score set to it. Let's talk about the last one then. And I deliberately ended on this one because I think this is one of the best films of the year in 2010. And it's a fantastic score. This is Black Swan by, the score's by Clint Mansell. The film is by Darren Aronofsky. A really dark tale, Natalie Portman as a ballerina. And it's a really sinister sort of thriller set around that kind of, world of performance. And Mansell's score is entirely based on Swan Lake by Tchaikovsky, so one of the most famous, pieces of music ever. But he does significant changes to it, and he infuses it with, synthetic aspects, and blends it all together in this rousing kind of conclusion. Particularly when you get to the last track, Perfection, which is just this incredible combination of dark Mansellian kind of themes and the Tchaikovsky epic conclusion to Swan Lake. I don't know what you think about I don't think I've ever heard what you think about Swan Lake, but I love this film completely, and the score has always completely enraptured me.
Yeah, I love that adjective Mansellian. That's brilliant. Yeah, I think it's right as well, because Clint Mansell's got a very, very distinctive sensibility in his film scores. Like Daft Punk, he came out of pop music. Obviously, pop will eat itself. I believe, was he the front man for that, or maybe the guitarist? He was with them. And subsequently, Clint Mansell's music has got a very, very kind of hard, often a very hard-edged, like rock-infused vibe to me. Think of things like Requiem for a Dream, which is very experimental. Those principles have informed a lot of his works for Darren Aronofsky. So this is interesting because what he's doing is you've got a collision between one of, if not the most famous ballets of all time, and a very, very singular modernistic composer who's known for experimental avant-garde textures. And I think the two things combine together very, very well. It's almost interesting, almost like The Social Network. What you've got is a sense of the organic traditional ballet and the synthetic contemporary tone of Mansell, and the way that these two things do a dance around each other in the manner of the idea of the film that Natalie Portman's character, the whole white swan, black swan thing. It's a really, really interesting, really compelling score. And as it darkens, it gets more and more interesting, because that's when Mansell's own voice starts to take over more and more. And you get more of a sense of the contrast as Natalie Portman's character slides toward her inevitably tragic, violent demise. Those principles start to clash more and more, and it becomes harder to unpick what's Tchaikovsky and what's Mansell, which is deliberate. And I think that makes it very compelling to listen to. It's another score that apparently was discredited from the Oscars because there was too much music derived from another source, which is a shame. The film itself is very disturbing. It's a great film. It's a very disturbing, I think, very creepy, very intense film for which Natalie Portman, I think, deservedly got the Oscar. She's tremendous in it. I find it it's an impressive film, and the music makes it more claustrophobic, definitely.
Yeah. It's a bit of an uncanny film, and it's not one of those. It's not an easy watch in a way, it's a strange film, but that's Aronofsky for you. This is the guy who went on to, have rock monsters in Noah. So, he's a strange guy, but he's brilliant, and frequently brilliant. And I think Black Swan is one of his best. And it's just a wonderful, sort of darkly twisted version of Swan Lake that you get in this music. And, that blend of the classical, the truly classical style with, what Mansell brings to it is fantastic. So it's a great score.
You mentioned Noah there. The other thing about Noah was you had Ray Winston go, "Get out here, Noah, you slag," like that. Pretty much like there's a lot of that going on in it.
Yeah. I'd forgotten about that. I might have to go back and watch Noah, because I remember watching Noah thinking this is mental, but I maybe need to go back and watch it again just for the Winston.
Winston, get out of here, slag.
Oh well. On that note, I think we'll draw a line under this. And I had to finish with a really good one. I had to finish with a really good score, even though we've talked about some dire movies. I suppose I'd finish by asking you, Sean, really what you think about how the decade went. We're sitting here in 2010, the middle of 2010. No, we're not. We're sitting here.
We've actually forgotten what time it is. Let's face it, everyone has.
Yeah, we've time travelled. We're sitting here in the middle of 2020. So we've had 10 years of scores and films. What do you think about the decade as a whole? Do you think that the 2010s created some really great music? I do. I think we've had some spectacular movies and we've had some spectacular scores along the way.
Yeah, I think it's been very interesting. I think to take it back even further, from the 2000s, the Hans Zimmer school of scoring action movies really took over, to the dismay of a lot of film score fans like me who prefer the kind of slightly more organic traditional approach. I think that approach started to come back in more and more throughout the 2010s. If you think of what Alan Silvestri did with the likes of the Avengers, and then Alexandre Desplat with Godzilla, that style has started to I think start to come back in, that relentless Hans Zimmer bombast. And I don't want to rag on Hans Zimmer because he is one of my favourite film composers, but that's a side of his personality, musical personality, that I don't really like, and I don't like the way that has shaped a lot of action music. I think we have got more back into that traditional mould. I think one of the things that has happened with film scores in the last 10 to 15 years is that as films have become more franchise and merchandise led, there are a lot more invested parties, not just in the films but in the music. And I think there are a lot more masters that composers now have to answer to, particularly as comic book franchise films have started to take over increasingly in the last 10 years with the development of the MCU and then the DC Extended Universe. That, I think, has made the job of film composers a lot harder. There are a lot of people to please. Schedules have become more and more pressured. But I think that in the last decade, there was a remarkable amount of innovation. There were a remarkable plethora of new and old voices that were established. And I think that things are more optimistic about film music than I think is generally given credit for. I mean, I know I often say about, for example, Jerry Goldsmith, you don't get scores of this caliber anymore. And you might not get scores quite of that caliber, but you're getting things that aren't far off. And I look forward to seeing what this decade is going to bring, frankly.
Yeah, I think we're due some really good, fascinating stuff, and that builds on a lot of these things. I think you're absolutely right in your summation there. I think 2010s was a pretty good decade. There was some great stuff, and this was a good start. 2010 was a good start, so it's been really fun to pick through some of these particular gems for not such gems of movies. But yeah, it's been great. And I think when we come back next, Sean, I think we might finally have Tenet here.
Oh, so, that's me breathing a sigh of relief. So
yeah, at last. Yeah. So we hopefully will have a big new score from Ludwig Göransson to finally talk about. So we'll see how that goes. We might well get into that in our next episode. But we shall see. We'll see what happens. But until then, thank you for joining us for another episode. Remember, we're part of the We Made This podcast network, and the music of the best of 2010 is all we're discussing, so we'll give you a little taste about what else is on the network in a second. But until then, we hope you enjoy the film music we've discussed and listen to our playlist. We hope you're still well and you're staying safe, and we'll see you next time when we discuss the music of film Between the Notes. Elsewhere on We Made This. Ask us about Loom, a point-and-click podcast. Because the other PC kind of things were much more expensive to buy. I mean, the Amiga wasn't cheap either. So you tended to play these things, you know, in a way, it almost meant that point-and-click adventure games, which weren't on the consoles, were they really back then? They were more they were a bit more expensive to play, I think, back then.
Yeah, I can remember, I think... I was at my friend from primary school had a NES, and he had Maniac Mansion.
On the NES, really?
Yeah.
Would it have been the same? Was it exactly the same, like style though?
Yeah, because I think you used the cursor to move the joypad to move the cursor.
I didn't know they had it on like a console that far back. Because obviously it's much more common now, isn't it, that you have them on consoles and.
Oh yeah.
Frame to frame.
Is because they thrive on an underclass, and yet in order for the Kims to want to aspire themselves, families like the Parks needs to exist in order so that they can work their way up. Yeah, and
I sort of steered you away from politics earlier, but it's ultimate capitalism, isn't it? That's what we're being shown here. It's the tipping point of capitalism, in that very few have a lot and a lot have very little.
Free with this month's issue.
Best of all the Britpop bands for me, I reckon. Although these days, listening back to the lyrics, Jarvis does come off as a little bit of a sex pest.
Yeah, a little. just a lot.
Yeah.
I can't think of any other vocalist that spends so much time getting up close to the mic and going,
A lot of his songs are about cracking onto someone else's girlfriend because he doesn't think that their partner is good enough for them, and he would do better.
Mm-hmm. Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. Between the Notes is produced and edited by Tony Black, who hosts alongside Sean Wilson. You can find Tony on Twitter at AJBlackWriter and Sean on Twitter at Seano22. You can find Between the Notes on Twitter at BTW_notes, on iTunes, your podcast app of choice, on Spotify, Stitcher and on Spreaker, where the show is part of the We Made This podcast network. For more podcasts all about TV, film, books, music and popular culture in general, you can find We Made This on Facebook and on Twitter at We Made This Pod. Thanks for listening.